Hey, and welcome to this week's video. This time, I'm going to be showing you how I make a handled pourer from the very beginning to the very end. The process starts with wedging, which is essentially kneading, but the opposite, as the intention is to remove all the air from this massive clay, alongside making it totally homogeneous. The consistency of the clay needs to be as even as possible when throwing on the wheel. Any inconsistencies or pockets of air will only make throwing much more difficult. Although this clay body looks like terracotta, it's actually just a high iron stoneware clay body, meant for reduction firing, which is a process I'll speak about later on in this video. Once wedged up, each of these lumps is weighed out at 12 ounces each, or 340 grams. I then give each mass of clay a quick little spiral wedge, which brings together the weighed out pieces. It's quite a difficult process to show well as my hands are covering most of what I'm doing, but essentially it's the same motions that I would use for spiral wedging larger masses of clay, simply on a much smaller piece. I like to use clay that's a little bit firmer for these. It lets me throw a form that's a lot thinner, and as these forms will have a pouring spout that protrudes from the side, it means I can't trim the entirety of the walls. So I really try to throw these as thinly as I can. The throwing process begins with coning the clay up and down a few times. This is essentially like wedging on the wheel and helps to align all the disc-shaped clay particles. Centering is really a process about keeping your hands as firm and steady as possible. It's a soft material after all, so any shape you give it, it should conform to. Back when I was learning to throw and center clay, I would watch my hand on the outside of the ball. As if it wobbled or shook at all, I knew the ball of clay underneath wasn't centered. So it just became a matter of tensing that hand up to the point where there's absolutely no movement and it's running completely smooth. Once I've centered and opened up the clay, I proceed to lifting up the walls of clay from the reserves in the bottom. The aim here is to distribute the clay as evenly as possible throughout the walls of the pot. Making sure it's very lubricated with water, I pinch in the bottom with my knuckle on the outside and my fingers on the inside. I then squeeze and lift in one even, steady motion. Consistency is key here. You don't want to rush the process, you don't want to stop and start. I'm just applying that single motion with the same pressure all the way up to the top. As these are thrown so thinly, it can take a number of pulls to get to my pointer, which is the rubber knife looking thing you can see just above the pot here. They measure both the height and the width of the vessel you're making, and can be incredibly useful for production throwing, where you want every single piece to be more or less identical. Thankfully the model I use has a retractable point, so I can just lift it out of the way if my clay gets too close. The model I use was made by my friend and potter Darren Ellis. I'll leave a link to his shop below in the description, where he occasionally sells them. Once the height of the walls has been achieved, I can move on to the finishing procedures. I begin by removing any excess water from the inside, and then I scrape away the skirt of clay at the base here. I keep a bucket of reclaim to the side of my wheel, which I chuck bigger scraps straight into, which helps keep my splash tray on my actual wheel a lot cleaner. I then use a metal kidney to scrape clean the outside of the pot. This neatens up the form, which removes the more prominent throwing rings, and makes it easier to lift off the wheel later on. And really I'm pushing the clay out against the metal, not so much the metal into the clay. I then use a chamois leather to smooth off the sharp rim, and finally I use a wetted finger in between two dry fingers that brace the walls of the pot to flick out the spout. I then slice it off and lift it away, making sure that my hands are dry as I grasp and lift away the pot, otherwise they would just stick, and the pot would be distorted and most likely ruined. You may notice too that at the moment I lift, I also spin the wheel, which helps break the seal between the clay and the metal. As these soft pots dry out, the spouts will loosen and they lose their shape, so every now and then I'll do what you see here, where I pinch in either side of the spout just to redefine the shape. Otherwise, if you weren't to do this, you could come in the next morning and find that the shapes are much less defined and the vessel won't pour nearly as well. I'll then keep them uncovered for the rest of the day before covering them in plastic overnight. The plastic just means they don't dry out too much while I'm away. When working with pottery of any kind, the dryness of the piece you're working on is absolutely critical. It's very easy to forget about something and let it get too firm, and at that point there's very little you can do. Once these are leather hard, it's time to trim. Trimming is a process where we clean up the outside edge, and the bottom especially. I stick these back onto the wheel by just using a bit of water on the base, and rub the pot until it's in the centre of the wheel. The friction and water create slip, and the slip, which is essentially liquid clay, welds the pot firmly in place. I then begin to trim the walls, and you'll notice that I always have one hand on the outside of the pot just to support it, and to catch it if it were to spin off out of control. As the spout gets in the way, you'll notice I also stop trimming just beneath it, which also means I have to trim in a very specific way, where I stop and start, just so I don't bash into the spout. I then use the sharp edge of the kidney just to scrape away the area underneath, where I couldn't trim it previously. I then slide my sharp potter's knife underneath the vessel to cut the piece away, and then I use a wetted finger just to smooth over the area I was scraping underneath the spout. I'm just trying to make the area flow nicely from the spout into the wall. I don't want there to be any sharp lumps or scratches that might interfere with the glaze when it's put over top. Once that is neat and tidy, I move on to trimming the base. I delicately place the pot upside down and tap center it into the middle, and then I use soft lumps of clay to hold the piece firmly in place. It's very easy to distort the pot when you're doing this, but to avoid that, when I attach these, I'm pushing the clay downward against the metal rather than pushing it firmly into the pot itself. Once held in place, it's time to trim the bottom. My left hand here is constantly applying downward pressure whenever I'm trimming. This acts as another layer of protection. In case the pot were to jump out, my left hand is there to push it back down. I trim a beveled edge onto the corner, which will prevent it from chipping, and I then burnish the underside, just to make sure it's nice and smooth, and to remove any of the wiring off marks there might be. And finally I can stamp them with my little F, my maker's mark, which is essentially just my signature. This isn't the last time these pots will be on the wheel. Once the handles have been attached, I'll put them back on and go over the bases for one final little bit of quality control. Between now and attaching the handles, I'll wait a little bit. Trimming always reveals softer clay underneath, so I let them sit a bit just to develop a bit of a harder skin on the outside of the piece. The initial handle blanks I used are pulled from a much larger block of clay. This is quite a traditional method for pulling handles, and it's a skill I honed for 3 years during my apprenticeship, where I must have pulled thousands of the things. The block of clay is worked into a roughly conical shape, and then I use a wetted hand to pull quite firmly from the top all the way to the bottom. As soon as I feel there's any friction during this process, I'll dunk my right hand into the water, as if your hand becomes too dry, or the clay becomes too dry, you risk tearing away the long length of clay. These don't have to be pulled too thinly, as I'll be attaching them to the jugs and pulling them again to make them even finer. Once pulled to the correct length and thinness, I put them onto the edge of the board and I use my thumb to snip them off to the right length. I try to make these lengths as consistent as possible, as eventually it will lead to having more consistent and even handles. Once the length of clay starts to become fatter as it reaches the top of the block, I know it's time to start pulling again. The wood will dry these out quickly, so if it's a hot day, I'll stack them, and I'll even wrap them in plastic and spray them to keep them from drying out. Really, I want them as soft as possible, as it makes the attaching and pulling process far easier. I then score the clay using a serrated kidney where the handle will go, making sure it's on the opposite side to where the spout is. I then dab some slip over the scored area, which acts as glue and makes for a very strong join. In fact, often when you find broken pottery, the pieces that remain attached and joined even after years and years are the area where the handle meets the wall of clay. I then take one of these blanks and begin to tap out one of the ends, which creates a flare. This flare will provide material that's easily blendable into the wall of clay, and therefore makes the process of attaching the handle to the pot before you pull it much easier. I then firmly push the handle blank onto the pot, making sure there are fingers inside the vessel, counteracting the pressure pushing inward the whole time. I then use a dry finger just to smooth this clay in, which creates a very strong join. I also spend a few seconds at this point neatening up the join, either by just smoothing it with a finger and then even using a little bit of water, just to make sure it's nice and tidy. I always make my handle blanks a little bigger than they need be, as I prefer to have too much material to work with rather than too little. I can always simply snip away excess handle, but there's no way of adding to it if initially it's too short. Now the real pulling and shaping begins. I grasp right at the top of the handle, and with each pull I'm squeezing with the exact same pressure from top all the way to bottom in fast, consistent movements, a lot like when you're pulling the walls of clay up when you're throwing the pot. Once the length has been achieved, I use my thumb just to pull in some grooves in the back of the handle. This helps to thin it out further. It also creates areas where my glazes will be able to pool. I then angle the clay downward, make sure it's nice and straight, especially in relation to the spout on the opposite side. I then snip away the excess before blending it in, which is first done with just a dry finger, before moving on to a wetted finger to smooth over all my finger marks. At this point the handles are still incredibly wet, so I'll leave them a little bit before I move on to the next step, which is just one final quick cleanup of the base. As I handled these right at the end of the day, I had to wrap them with plastic overnight, which is good as it lets the clay of the handle, which is much softer, acclimatise to the thrown clay of the jug, which means by morning they'll more or less be exactly the same consistency, which is ideal for when you want to dry them out at the same rate. Cracks generally only form on handles when you try and rush them, say if the handle dries out faster than the body, or if the body dries out much faster than the handle. This kind of drying will cause a split to occur somewhere, and handle cracks can be notoriously difficult to fix. I mean, it's probably worth just destroying the pieces and starting again. The following morning I'll unwrap these for them to go back on the wheel, just for a quick tidy up. All I want to do at this point is remove any tiny scratches there might be on the bottoms, or burrs of clay that have become lodged into the bases as I've moved them around when attaching their handles. When I was in college in Ireland studying ceramics, we had an external examiner who was incredibly critical of the pot's bottoms. Even if the rest of your pot was beautiful, he'd turn it over and look at the bottom, and if he found any mistake, he would always bring it up and question you about it. And nowadays I find myself being there right with him. Turning over a handmade pot to find a base that's been forgotten about and neglected is kind of disappointing, especially if the person's put in hours of work into the rest of the piece. Sadly, the only part of this process I forgot to film was the bisque firing, so you'll have to ignore that, and I'll try and capture it next time. So these jugs you're seeing now have actually been fired in my electric kiln up to 1000 degrees centigrade, a process which turns the clay from a material that is clay into a material that's ceramic, and very porous. The next step is to apply wax onto the bases, which acts as a simple resist for when I'm glazing. You'll see that I dab a little bit extra just where my maker's mark is, as cleaning glaze out of that little notch can be very tricky. The jugs at this stage are still fragile, but not nearly as much as when they were bone dry, especially as mine are made very thinly. If I were to squeeze the rim too hard, they'd still crack and split at this stage. Waxing is quite a quick process. I can easily do several hundred pieces in a few hours. Being able to tap center makes a big difference and definitely speeds up this process no end. This wax emulsion I'm using is really bog standard. I think most pottery suppliers will sell the same thing. I simply mix a little bit of boiling water with mine and give it a really thorough mix, which helps it brush on more neatly. The next step is glazing. The pot is delicately grasped between a pair of tongs and submerged into the glaze for a number of seconds. The porous clay body draws in all the water of this solution, leaving just a powdery layer on the outside of all the minerals and oxides and materials of your base glaze. The red colour of this glaze simply comes from red iron oxide mixed into the solution. This here is just 2%, and once reduction fired, this red changes into a deep dark green. Once glazed, I'll leave the pots for a number of days. This way the moisture in the clay body evaporates and the powder becomes a lot easier to clean up. I simply rub over any excess drip marks and the tong marks, and generally I just try to make the glaze surface as smooth and even as possible, as the neater it is now, the neater it'll look once fired. It's important to note that not all glazes can be treated the same. Some pieces will always show tong marks no matter what, and you have to find alternative ways of glazing them. My one, as it melts at a very high temperature and becomes quite glassy, hides a lot of these small marks that are left. The last step of the glazing process is just to wipe off the bottom. Even though it's waxed, small particles of glaze will settle onto it. So I use a wet sponge to go over it, removing the excess glaze and also neatening up the line where glaze and clay meet. I catch all this wasted glaze in the bowl of water beneath, and eventually I can add this back to my main bucket of glaze later on. So there's very little waste. And now, that's it. I'm ready to pack the kiln. After, of course, I've glazed and done the same process to around 200 more pieces. Each pot is carefully placed into the gas kiln, with a few millimeters separating each one. They can't touch during this process, as if they do they'll stick forever, and the only way to unstick them is to just smash them up with a hammer. It's for this reason I have to remove all the glaze on the basis of these pots, as the raw clay itself won't stick to the shelves of the kiln. The layer of glaze on these vessels at this stage is incredibly delicate. One small knock or error can cause a whole area of it to chip away, so I have to be incredibly careful during this entire process, which makes getting these shelves in at awkward angles all the more difficult. Thankfully, the glazes I use are very stable. They barely run at all from where they're put, so I don't have to worry too much about cleaning up the shelves after these firings. It's one of the joys after all these years of using other people's kilns. I can finally keep my own one in absolutely pristine condition. As I handle these pots, the powder comes off of my fingers, so in between touching, say, a red vessel and then a white vessel, I have to always rub down my hand so I don't get powder on them. The packing of the kiln itself doesn't take very long, a couple of hours at most, if that. It's sort of like a giant three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle, as you're trying to fit in as much as you physically can, as you want a dense pack. The denser the pack, the better it'll fire, and also the better reduction you'll get, and it'll be more cost efficient. And that's that. The following morning I come in very early, and I light the gas kiln up, making sure, always, that the doors of the kiln are open when I ignite the gas. I fire this kiln with mains gas, which is a first for me. In the past I've always used bottled propane, and I can definitely say that not having to worry about your supply is a real luxury. For the first couple of hours I keep my burners relatively low. You want to slowly creep up the temperature as you fire. Once my digital pyrometer reads 860 degrees, I set the kiln into reduction. I do this by sliding the dampers over the flue halfway. I then increase the gas pressure to 10 mbar, and I increase my air pressure to 0.42 bar. This causes the kiln's internal atmosphere to burn inefficiently. The gas simply doesn't have enough oxygen to burn properly, which causes the fuel to seek oxygen from within the clay and glazes itself, causing those red glazes you saw to turn into a deep green. If there was ample oxygen, they would turn a kind of a mottled yellow, which isn't particularly nice. As the fuel inside is seeking oxygen to burn properly, larger and larger flames begin to come out of the spy hole and out of the flues at the back. My firings last for about 9.5 hours from start to finish. There are 4 burners underneath the kiln, which each jettison flame into the kiln's chamber. Slowly the temperature increases, up until my cones start to go over. I aim for about 1290 degrees centigrade, and I keep the kiln in a strong reduction atmosphere right up until the end. In this clip I'm blowing inside the kiln through one of the spy holes. Doing this reveals the area where there are small little measuring devices inside called cones, which bend over at certain temperatures. What I never noticed until filming this actually was how blowing in affects the flames that are coming out of the back. And finally, after 9.5 hours, once my cones have all bent over to the right position, it's time to close off the kiln, which is always a very satisfying moment as the noise quietens. I then crash cool the kiln from 1295 degrees back down to 1000 degrees, and I do this by opening the flue up fully and by pulling out the 2 spy holes on the front of the door. This process helps the glazes maintain their colour and also stops it from overfiring, as it can potentially keep rising just at the moment you turn it off. And finally, I can close the dampers fully, and I can also put the bungs back into the spy holes. Some 48 hours later, and it's finally time to open up the kiln. At this point it's still about 100 degrees centigrade inside, but it cools down quickly once the doors are cracked open. This is always such an anxiety-inducing moment, as you can never really see what's going on inside during the process, and it's only after finally opening the door that you know whether things have gone well or not. I'll then take out each pot one by one, inspecting each as I go. In the middle you can see those 3 little white bent-over spikes. These are the cones I was looking at through the spy holes. These are what really tell me what's going on inside the kiln during the firing, as they measure heat work, which is heat over time, whereas the digital pyrometer simply tells you whether the temperature is going up or down. All in all, I can fit around 150 pieces in this kiln per firing, depending on their size of course. And finally, here's the finished jug, which I showed you how to throw, trim, handle, wax, glaze, and finally fire. If you made it this far, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.